us again today, and we pray a blessing on our study and help us to grow in wisdom and insight in your way of nonviolence. We offer our prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so today we are studying the final lesson in the sixth cycle, which is temple and its deconstruction. And this is the one where we focus on how Jesus took his scripture and interpreted those scriptures and made them uniquely his own. So last week we looked at how the whole cycle has been on the temple and its deconstruction. And the first lesson we looked at how the temple was established, and we talked about how temples and sacrifice are a universal human phenomenon, grew up spontaneously across the globe. It's a subconscious, uh, not instinctive, but it's something deeply inherent in the human psyche to the need to do that, to do sacrifice. And we talked and reviewed the theories of René Girard and his theories about scapegoating and how scapegoating uh, transitioned over to sacrificial practice and became more institutionalized. And then we looked at also how in last week we looked at the prophetic witness against corruption in the temple, that the prophets had a deep-seated unease with the temple as an institution, in large part because temples and secular rulers go hand in hand. um, that there's a strong link between power, secular power, and temple authority. And that really, if you're a secular ruler, you need to get the temple on your side, um, and vice versa. Um, but the prophets had this sense that the temple was not essential to and was possibly, in fact, against God's plan. Um, because from the Exodus times, as we learned in one of the earlier cycles, uh, God God's first act was liberation, and his heart is for justice. And in fact, we looked last week at the different places where the prophets say that God wants justice, not sacrifice. We saw how the first temple was established by David and Solomon. Um, and that throughout human history, there has been this strong link between secular power and the temple, um, and that corruption as a result was often, played a part in the temple system. And at the time of Jesus, the corruption and the failure of the temple was was a hot issue. It was a live issue, um, and we saw in another lesson that the Qumran community, that was the community that lived in by the side the Dead Sea, where the Dead Sea Scrolls come from. They were and they practiced intense purity. They were kind of an extreme group that they left the city because the city was too corrupt. They denounced the temple. They removed themselves physically to the wilderness and established a community there. And they were waiting and praying for the great and terrible day of the Lord to come, where God would come and put everything right with his army of angels. Um, and they were looking towards the establishment of a completely new temple, similar to the one that Ezekiel described. And we looked in a couple of lessons ago about how Ezekiel has a focus on temple holiness. He really embraces the temple. Um, and we saw why that was the case, because they were Ezekiel is written around the time of the exile, where they were losing kings, court, the major structures of society were being destroyed or taken away from them. And so there was an emphasis on God and on their relationship with God. They still had that Deuteronomic worldview where God was could be wrathful, had the potential for violence, and they had to keep on the good side of God. So they Ezekiel was looking to the return and the building of a purer, more holy temple where they could have a cleaner, purer place for God to reside. And so he has this vision of the perfect temple, the building of this perfect temple. And I think that the Qumran community were looking for something similar, that God would come and the the temple would be rebuilt from scratch and all the corruption would be removed and it would be the perfect temple. So you already had the Qumran community denouncing the situation at the time of Jesus around the temple. Then John the Baptist also removed himself from uh, the city, but just as far as the River Jordan, he had a different message. But again, he was not looking to the temple for it. He didn't refer to the temple for his message of repentance, a new start, a fresh start, because the people had entered the land over the River Jordan. So baptizing people in the Jordan was a sort of symbolic of a fresh start, but without the temple as a basis for that new community to be built. But again, he also had the Deuteronomic worldview to some extent. He was also looking towards the day of the Lord coming and putting things right. He had not embraced the nonviolent God like Jesus did. So you can see that with both these approaches, there was a separation from the temple. But with Jesus, we get something completely different. He doesn't take himself off uh, and wait, in order to wait for a rebuilding of a perfect or new temple. What he does is he actually sets his face towards Jerusalem and he goes to the temple and has a showdown with the temple in order to render its very existence with its sacrifices obsolete. And that's the focus of today's lesson. So before we get into it, I just want to have a very short recap of temple and sacrifice. So we remember that they are these human institutions that arose to maintain order in society, basically in culture. They, according to Girard, scapegoating was a mechanism that spontaneously arose within human groups in order to discharge group violence because the human brain has outgrown instinctual constraints that stop animals killing each other and wiping out the whole herd or whole group. So the human brain had developed beyond that, evolved beyond that, and was now prey to the potential for catastrophic violence within the group because you get the mimetic rivalry building up. And from that, you get the potential for violence as people in rivalry for the object of desire. I'm hoping that this is all sounding familiar to you. And as this crescendo of tension and rivalry builds, the violence within the group starts getting to a point where it could cause major destruction within the group. And then the group's violence then hones in on one particular individual, usually an outsider, of some kind, and the violence of the group is discharged onto that scapegoat. Um, and with the killing of the scapegoat, there's a sense of release, of relief and release within the group, and there's a temporary um, sense of well-being, and that sense of well-being very quickly became associated with the divine, with the God, and and of course, because it was just a temporary reprieve, the need for another scapegoat would arise again, some weeks, months, whatever, days, weeks, months later, that tension, that violence would build again within a group, and another scapegoat would be needed to release the violence of the group. So across all human uh, groups and cultures, there developed sacrifice. That scapegoat mechanism was displaced onto a sacrificial animal. And that's why it became a global phenomenon. Um, and so when Jesus challenges the temple system, he's perceived as an extraordinary threat to the systems that control and keep us all in order. It's all subconscious, like people, until René Girard, really, we weren't aware of what was going on. So this is all sort of pre-conscious, but there's a sense that if you take away the temple or deconstruct the temple, you're going to destabilize everything, and that threat of violence is going to break out. So Jesus would be perceived as an extraordinary threat to the systems of control that have lain at the heart of our human culture for millennia. So in the temple leaders' minds, if Jesus is allowed to proceed, everything is going to fall apart. For them, the temple sacredness or temple holiness is what's, remember how this whole scapegoating mechanism and release is linked in the human mind or human psyche to God. So if you mess that system up, God's wrath is no longer going to be held in check. So what I wrote here is the sense of well-being that results from the sacrificial killing was perceived by those sacrificing as transcendent or otherworldly because it was so powerful, so effective. And so humans understood, or they believed, that God was the one desiring the sacrifice, rather than actually, as we now understand with René Girard, it is a human phenomenon. So when Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem, he's threatening something very deeply ingrained in human culture and psyche. He's perceived as a dangerous threat to the default human systems of control that are based in the scapegoating sacrificial principles. And as we've seen, because these systems are pre-rational, they're pre-conscious, they run very deep. And if you link that again with the Deuteronomic mindset that interprets the whole exile experience in terms of divine wrath and punishment, we looked at that with the Isaiah cycle especially. So you can see that anything that rocks that fragile system that keeps the world in order is going to be understood as incredibly dangerous. So when Jesus acts in the temple, he poses this enormous threat to the status quo. And it's this action when he goes into the temple to clear the temple, that's what signs his death warrant. I mean, he's upset the Pharisees, he's upset the temple leaders, different people throughout his ministry. But it's when he goes into the temple that we get people say, this man has to die. Okay. And it's because he claims an authority over the temple. He says something bigger than the temple is here with me. You don't need the temple anymore. He claims a messianic authority over the temple. And we're going to be looking at that, actually, what he did shortly. But before we do, I just want to say, because we're going to look at John's Gospel, John's account of the clearing of the temple in a minute. But John, the evangelist John, puts the clearing of the temple right up at the very first thing that Jesus does. Now, historically, that just could not have happened. I mean, the synoptic gospels that were written earlier place it right at the end of his ministry, and that is much more consistent with, what was likely to have happened. Like I said, it signed his death warrant. He was crucified shortly after that. But John chooses to put the clearing of the temple right earlier on in chapter 2. And by doing that, directly after the prologue, and if you remember in the prologue, he's making, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. He's creating that closeness, that identification of Jesus with God, giving Jesus tremendous authority in the prologue. And then the first thing that the major action that he does, and that signals the most important thing that he's doing, is that he undoes and replaces temple practice. And John puts it right at the front because it's the herald, it's the signal of the major thing that Jesus did and achieved. So we're going to read that right now. And maybe if somebody wants to read John's version, which is John chapter 2, verses 13 to 17. This is the overturning of the tables in the temple. Do we have a volunteer for this? So in John's Gospel, you get the prologue and the calling, John the Baptist narrative, and then the wedding feast at Cana, where he embraces his ministry. It's given to him. And then the first thing he then does is clear the temple. So does somebody want to read chapter 2, verse 13 through to 17?
I can do that.
Okay.
When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of, sorry, I just lost it. I'm getting back to it though.
Okay, that's okay.
Where are we? 13.
Verse 15.
Yeah. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me."
Yes.
That's it. Sorry.
You can stop there. I mean, it does go on as well, but we'll just stop there for the moment.
Yeah.
So when people talk about these passages that we're reading about Jesus' action in the temple, often I want you to move away from the cleansing of the temple, the cleaning of the temple. People use that word. Jesus isn't really cleansing the temple. What he's doing is he's driving out the animals here. He's overturning the money changer tables, and he's driving out the sacrificial animals. So those two pieces were essential for the mechanism, the practice of the sacrifice in the temple. The money changers were there because at the time of Jesus, the main currency in Jerusalem was the shekel, right? The temple, however, used something called Tyrian coin. And Tyrian coin would be like if you go to a poorer country and then you have the dollar as an optional currency. The Tyrian coin would be like the dollar. It was more valuable, it was more reliable, more valuable. And in order to purchase sacrificial animals, you would take the regular local currency, the shekel, to the temple. You would have to change it then into Tyrian coin, like to dollars, and then you could then purchase the sacrificial animals. So you can see that there's a tremendous whenever there's money being exchanged, there's always going to be a markup. There's always going to be someone making profit. Um, and so there is going to be the potential for abuse, and there was in that sort of system of exchange. But remember, and a lot of people focus in on that when Jesus was overturning the tables, it was because of the corruption in that money exchange process. Um, and and so you're back to cleaning up the actual practice of the temple when you think that way. So we're trying to move away from that cleansing, and making things pure again. We're trying to put that away and focus instead on what actually Jesus was doing. He was interrupting the process of sacrifice. I mean, I'm not saying that he wasn't also aware of the injustice and corruption of the money exchange process, but that wasn't, you don't get distracted by that, is what I'm saying. Because if you don't have money to buy animals, there's no sacrifice. If you drive the animals out, there's no sacrifice. Um, so anyway, that's just an aside there. So basically, Jesus is in these accounts interrupting the sacrificial process. So we're going to read another account of it here. Mark 11. This is one of the synoptics accounts. Mark 11, 15 to 17.
I can read it if you would like.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
Let me see. Just gotta pull it up.
You could actually go 15 through to 19, just
Mark 11, 15 through to 19.
yeah.
Okay. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money chargers or changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. As he taught them, he said, "It is not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teachings. When evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the
Okay.
morning,
No, sorry, you can stop right there.
very good.
We're going to read that bit in a minute, but we'll just stop there for the moment. So just a couple of things to note. Where Susie read in verse 16, and Jesus would not allow anyone to carry any merchandise through the temple. That's what you read. He was disrupting the flow. He was overturning the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold the doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple, is what my version says. That word for anything is a technical word. It's actually skios, Skeus, which means a temple vessel, a vessel used in the temple for carrying the implements and the sacred vessels, like that collected the blood, the meat, or sacrificial meat, or the embers, the coals used in the burnt sacrifices. And when we looked at the Kings and the Chronicles passages, when we were talking about the establishment of the temple under David and Solomon, in the we looked at how David had fitted out the temple, and that same word, skios, implement, temple implement, is in the list of what he puts into the temple when he's establishing it. So it's very clear that what Jesus isn't stopping merchandising is not merchandise, which is like a modern sort of concept here, but it's not like mementos of the Pope or something in the Vatican. What he's stopping and carrying is the temple vessels. Okay. So that's just one thing to point out. Um, uh, so the other thing I wanted just to mention was that Jesus is not getting angry here. I mean, a lot of people say, well, Jesus got angry when he cleared the temple because he overturned the tables and he made a whip and he was driving out the animals. That's violence, right? So I want to make sure that we understand that what Jesus is doing here is a prophetic witness. He makes a whip. So for one thing, if you make a corded whip, you have to sit down and it takes time to braid the cords into a whip. And we have a local member here called Stephanie who works in a stable, and she brought in a corded whip that you can crack, and it made a tremendous sound. I mean, it's a very scary sound. But the corded whips are not designed to actually hit the animals. They're meant to make that crack sound in order to drive the animals out. I mean, animals respond very quickly to the sound of a crack of the whip, but then they're not, the whip is not really designed to as something to beat up animals with. It's designed to create that noise and generate a sort of stampede kind of effect. And the fact that he's sitting down and taking maybe half an hour, 40 minutes to make the cord is it's not something he has suddenly, he walks into the temple as a fit of anger and starts driving out the animals, right? It's something, it's very pointed and deliberate act that he's doing. In the same way that, for example, Jeremiah smashes the pots as a symbol of the coming the destruction of Jerusalem. So what he's doing is a prophetic witness that will disrupt and interrupt the sacrificial process taking place in the temple. Jesus quotes from Jeremiah, and we actually read that passage last week or last time from Jeremiah 7, where it says, "Is it not written, my house should be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have turned it into a den of robbers." And again, robbers are thieves or people who steal with violence. A robbery implies violence. They both steal and kill. So, and then at the end of that passage, we saw how the chief priests and scribes heard it, and they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of the crowds who were spellbound by his teaching. So you can see at this point, this is where Jesus, like I said, seals his own death warrant. And in John, we won't go back to John, but well, actually, John 11, verse 48. I'll just read that verse. And it says, if we let him go on like this is the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the council and said, "What are we to do? This man is performing many signs, and if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed." So you can see that this was a key event, and the mindset of the chief priests about how disruptive and dangerous Jesus' action is. And something that we're going to look at now at some passages that prove that it was Jesus' intention to bring the temple to an end, and not just to clean it and make it more holy and make it more acceptable. He wanted to actually get rid of the temple practice. And we know that that was in his mind, because if we go back to that Mark passage that Susie read, Mark 11, either side of the clearing of the temple passage, there's this this narrative where Jesus curses the fig tree. So on the way to the temple, where he goes in and clears the temple, he sees a fig tree, and he is looking for fruit to eat, and he can't find any fruit. And then he curses the tree. Then when he comes, then he leaves, and after he's cleared the temple, he then goes back and back to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he and his disciples were staying. And then the next day, the disciples see that the tree has withered. We're going to read those two passages, okay? Just to set the scene here as well. If you're outside of Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives, there's a sort of a valley goes down, and then there's the Temple Mount here, okay? So that in other parts of the Gospels, it's written that Jesus, when he was in Jerusalem in his final days, he and his disciples chose to hang out and stay outside of the city on the Mount of Olives. That's where their hangout was. So they would walk to and from Jerusalem each day from the Mount of Olives. So that's just setting the scene. So if somebody wants to read 11 verse 12 through 14, and then 20 through 25. Would somebody read that? Maybe I could read it, actually, if you want to have a little break here. Okay, so on the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. And then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry any temple implements through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. When Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Whenever you stand praying, forgive. if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. So in this narrative, Jesus says, that if you, well, directly in relation to the withered fig tree, he says to Peter or the disciples, look, if you have faith, you can say to this mountain, be taken up and get thrown into the sea. And if you don't doubt, but believe, it will be done for you. Instead, pray and forgive. Basically, that's what he's saying. And when he's on his way to Jerusalem, the mountain he's talking about is the Temple Mount. So when he says you can, if you want, you can say to this mountain, if you can get thrown into the sea, because he's traveling into the city. He sees the fig tree before he enters the temple, and as a prophetic witness, the fig tree representing the temple, he's looking for the fruit of spirituality, of faith, and he's not finding it. He's not finding anything. He's looking for the fruit of mercy, the fruit of hesed, of faithfulness, and he's not finding it. Instead, he's finding violence and corruption. So the tree representing the temple, Jesus brings it to an end. It's a very powerful prophetic sign that symbolizes this irreversible break. It's not Jesus being hangry, I'm hungry. And this fig tree, which obviously is not going to have figs because it's not a season for figs, so it doesn't make any sense that Jesus, out of a fit of pique, would just say, well, I'm just going to curse this tree because I wanted to eat something and there's nothing on the tree. I mean, that's just not, it wouldn't be in the gospel. Well, it doesn't fit with Jesus anyway, but everything that is in the gospel has a reason for being in the gospel. It has some message and meaning for the reader. And so it's not Jesus being hangry here. So he says that the temple can be thrown into the abyss. Remember, the sea is the place of primordial chaos, where out of which God creates, but is saying send it back into that place. It doesn't belong in the new creation. And what he says replaces temple is forgiveness. You don't need a temple, because if you remember, sacrifice is the way that human beings have projected their own violence onto God. And they see the sacrifice as a way, therefore, of appeasing and pleasing a potentially very violent and wrathful God. And that sense of the holy, that dreadful, oppressive sense of the holy, all of that is bound up in temple practice. Jesus says you don't need that. All you need is pray, which is that direct relationship with God, the Father, and forgive, mercy. Okay, so in the same way the prophet said, God desires mercy, not sacrifice, Jesus is reiterating that here. He's saying, if you practice forgiveness, if you practice mercy, you do not need to have sacrifice. So if you practice nonviolence and forgiveness, you're discharging your violence without sacrifice. There's no need for that sacrificial system if you practice non-violence and forgiveness and mercy, because you yourself, with this relationship to God, are replacing that need for the scapegoating sacrificial system. So forgiveness is what deconstructs and replaces sacrifice. And we become one with, in that relationship, a prayerful relationship that we build with the Father or Mother, God. We begin to see, instead of displacing our violence onto God in that whole scapegoating sacrificial system and making God this violent figure, through the relationship with a non-violent God, we understand God is non-violent. There's no wrath in God. And we begin to then reflect that in ourselves and grow. We mirror the non-violence of God and become more non-violent ourselves. So we're going to look at one other main passage here, and that is the passage in John where John talks of the Good Shepherd. Okay. I know I'm doing a whole lot of talking. If anyone wants to just shout out or chip in or interrupt, go right ahead. Do you have any comments or thoughts about anything that I'm saying? But if we turn to John chapter 10, this is the long passage about the Good Shepherd. And it could also be the True Shepherd, as often Good or True Shepherd passage. And this is where he again reinforces his critique of the temple. Now, this passage has often been read sentimentally, that Jesus snuggles up to the little lambs, and we are like the little lambs in his flock, and he takes good care of us, like a pastoral kind of image, right? And the artwork, Christian art, often depicts it that way. And I'm not saying that's not, there's not some truth in all that, but what I really want to focus in on here is to recall that sheep were the primary sacrificial animal. Okay. And we talked, I think, in the first lesson in the cycle, how a sacrificial animal has to be meek. It has to be gentle, because if it doesn't accept its role as a sacrificial animal, if it starts fighting back, then it doesn't achieve the purpose of sacrifice, which is to discharge our violence onto the animal. So the animal has to be not accepting, but it has to have the appearance of being accepting of its fate in order for the whole sacrificial process to work and the human violence to be discharged onto it and to get that sort of sense of relief. Okay. Release. So the sheep, just remember that sheep are sacrificial animals. And earlier in John 2, when we were read that passage of Jesus clearing the temple, he found the people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at the tables, and making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple. So that word "drive out" is the same word that is used here in this passage. It's often translated as the Good Shepherd leads the sheep out, but actually he drives the sheep out. Okay, it's the same word in verse 4 of this passage. So does somebody want to read the Jesus, the Good Shepherd passage from 10 verse 1 through to, actually it's the whole chapter, it's through to 42. It's a long one if somebody wants to try and read that or part of it.
I can read it.
Okay, go for it, Marcy.
All right. Very truly, I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in by another way is a thief and a bandit. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. Jesus used this figure of speech with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So again, Jesus said to them, "Very truly, I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and bandits, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters by me will be saved and will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because a hired hand does not care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also. And they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. I have received this command from my Father. Again, the Jews were divided because of these words. Many of them were saying, "He has a demon and is out of his mind. Why listen to him?" Others were saying, "These are not the words of one who has a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?" At that time, the festival of the dedication took place in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him, and he said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." Jesus answered, "I have told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name testify to me, but you do not believe, because you do not belong to my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. What my Father has given me is greater than all else, and no one can snatch it out of the Father's hand. The Father and I are one." The Jews took up stones again to stone him. Jesus replied, "I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these are you going to stone me?" The Jews answered, "It is not for a good work that we are going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, though only a human being, are making yourself God." Jesus answered, "Is it not written in your law, I said you are gods? If those to whom the word of God came were called gods, and the scripture cannot be annulled, can you say that the one whom the Father has sanctified and sent into the world is blaspheming because I said, I am God's son? If I am not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, so that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am the Father." Then they tried to arrest him again, but he escaped from their hands. He went away again across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing earlier, and he remained there. Many came to him, and they were saying, "John performed no sign." But everything that John said about this man was true, and many believed in him there.
Okay, actually, that sort of went a little bit beyond the shepherd narrative, but it was kind of interesting that this all takes place around the temple, one of the feasts, the festival of dedication. He's walking in the temple, and again the Jews are seeking to stone him because he's claiming that authority, that messianic authority, and making claims that are upsetting like I say, upsetting the systems of temple authority. But going back to the earlier part of that passage, again, that at verse 4, when he had, as it says, brought out all his own. It should be when he had driven out all of his own, he then goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him. So it's the same action that he did in the clearing of the temple. He's driving out the sacrificial animals in order to then become their shepherd. He becomes the shepherd of the sacrificial animals. And then also in verse 10, it says the thief, and this talked about the thief earlier. They will not follow a stranger, they will run from him. Oh yeah, they say in verse 1, very truly I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate but climbs in by another way is a thief and a bandit. So it's again the robber. And then here at verse 9 or verse 10, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. And the word there that's used is actually the word for kill is to sacrifice, is the technical word to sacrifice an offering on the altar. So it should really be, if it was literally translated, it should be the shepherd leads the sheep out of the, sorry. Oh, what did I write here? It says, so the passage should be read as those who come before the shepherd come to steal, sacrifice, and destroy. The shepherd leads the sheep out of the temple to the pasture. And the way he does this is by laying down his life non-violently. So by laying down his life non-violently, he can liberate and save the lives of the sacrificial animals. The sacrificial animals are also us. We're caught up in that sacrificial system. So I mean, it's not so much that I'm sure he cares for the animals, but the sacrificial animals become us, that we're all human beings caught up in that whole violent sacrificial system, who he's liberating. He's liberating and setting us free from that. So by giving his life non-violently, Jesus is then able to disable the violent mechanisms of sacrifice, and he replaces the temple in himself. And we see that actually in Matthew. If we read Matthew chapter 12. I mean, it's easy when you read, like when you read the Good Shepherd passage, it's easy just to let it wash over you and feel very sentimental about it. And it's all sort of warm and fuzzy feeling. But actually, when you read it like that, with the eyes of the conflict that he was engaged in, the situation he was engaged in at the time, the power of what he's saying comes through very strongly. And in terms of the tremendous courage that it took to do what he did, I mean, amazing, really. So we're going to
Mom,
yeah, go ahead.
you want to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just, did you want to say something or you want to read something?
No, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So I was going to just look at Matthew 12, 6 through 8. And here's where he says, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. He's talking about himself. The disciples had been picking grain on the Sabbath, which is the holy day, and they're being called out by the Pharisees and the priests, and it says, oh, have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So he's directly claiming authority over the rites, rituals associated with the temple, that holiness stuff that we were talking about last couple of lessons. And Jesus is citing from Hosea, which was one of the prophets we read last time, who was critiquing the temple and saying, about that God is looking for mercy, not sacrifice. And basically, if you enter into that prayer relationship, as I said before, with God, and you are not afraid of God, if God is no longer fearful because God is nonviolent, God is not going to judge you with violence and wrath. In fact, Jesus all the time is saying God is like your father, like your daddy. Go talk to him like your daddy, like your mommy. That's who God is. If you enter into that relationship without fear, there's no wrath that requires appeasement, then the temple is going to be obsolete. There's no reason, because God is already with you. There's no reason to go to the temple. If you remember, with the temple holiness mentality, you have to travel to the temple in order to get close to God, you know. Uh, in fact, in the previous lessons, we were seeing how the temple is associated with this temple holiness, which is that dread, the awe, the terror of the holy. And the further you get away from the temple, the less clean things become, right? With that mentality. So the Holy of Holies is the heart of the temple, and only the high priest was allowed into the Holy of Holies. And then there was the different courts, and the priests would be allowed in the inner courts, and then the men around that, and then the women at the outer courts. Women and children, they wouldn't be able to get very far into the temple because they weren't as considered as holy, clean, to enter into that holy space. And then in the city, the closer you were to the temple, the more holy and clean you could consider yourself. So then you get to Jesus, and Jesus was crucified outside the city gates at Golgotha, the place of the skull. And in fact, his body was cleared away before the Sabbath so as not to defile people. His corpse was considered something that would defile people. And so we have a very different sense of meeting, how you meet God with Jesus. And before his death, Jesus celebrates this meal, the Eucharist, right? The meal of the bread and the wine. And he chooses bread and wine as the sign of what's going to replace, or as a sign of what being a new human in this new non-sacrificial way, what that would look like. So he uses a bread and wine which was readily available in every house, every home in the city, and outside the city. Okay, a Eucharist can occur anywhere where you have bread and wine. Uses the simplest of and most ordinary, most available items. And it actually works the opposite way around. So whereas the temple, you have to go to the temple in order to get holy, the Eucharist takes the ordinary, the unclean, and transforms it into something beautiful. So that there is no space anywhere on earth where God cannot be felt and experienced, and that the whole earth is able to be transformed. There's no place that is more clean or unclean, and no place that is too dirty for God to enter into. And we also saw, and when we studied about the cup of wrath, how the Eucharist replaces that cup of wrath, of human wrath, with this cup of transformation, the cup of the transformed human creation. So in the Eucharist, Jesus is doing multiple different things. I mean, it's an amazing use of this sign. He replaces the sacrificial animal with bread and with wine. And the bread and wine also remind people of his non-sacrificial or non-violent, self-giving death. In a way, it was sacrificial in that humans kind of killed him, so he was made the scapegoat. But he himself, as we read in John's Gospel, chooses to give himself. He surrenders his life in order to redeem uh, and to transform the human beings. So, with the Eucharist, we enter into the seventh day of creation. And the Eucharist, that it discloses this non-violence and forgiveness. It's very pure, very simple. Now, having said that, I'm just going to end up by saying, before we get to our questions at the end here, that the Church has traditionally, through history, has been able and has at times transformed the Eucharist back into a sacrifice through some of the words and the language associated with Eucharistic practice or the Lord's Supper's practice. Some of the words that are said over the bread and the wine can bring you back into a sense of this is a sacrifice, and that the altar of the sacrifice. And we still use a lot of those terms: altar, sacrifice, sacrifice of the Mass. There's different kind of words that will shift you back into sacrificial thinking. And also, as we saw in the first lesson, how sacrificial, and last week as well, that we still, in our culture today, embrace holy objects, sacred spaces, things that, rituals, things that have that sense of the violence of the holy, just beneath the surface, like the flag or whatever, if you can't touch it or you can't do something disrespectful to it in a way that is that there's something greater than just the action, that you're going to in draw upon yourself basically wrathful violence of the holy, if you break the taboo or you break the ritual or you disrupt the ritual or you disrespect a holy object in some way. Or these are all ways in which the sacrificial system, that old entrenched sense of the dreadful holy, can be revived and is still alive and well in our world today. So I'm just saying to you that the Eucharist is this beautiful sign that Jesus gives us, but human beings have this ability to reintegrate it back into the sacrificial. So just to have that on your radar whenever you're dealing with or you experience the Eucharist, it's a whole wide range of how it's practiced. I just wanted to point that out. So it's therefore very important to have, in the book, we call it a single eye when looking at the Eucharist. And that single eye is mercy and forgiveness. If you practice and understand the Eucharist with that single eye of mercy and forgiveness, then it becomes this beautiful thing, this transforming thing that signifies and creates what it signs. And that's basically the end of the lesson today. So I hope again, I feel like I do a lot of talking in these classes, but I'm going to end with some questions. So now it's your time to speak. I'll read a couple of questions, and then if we have time, I'll read a couple more. So the first question is, to what extent do you think the church, as you experience it, has resacralized the Eucharist and recreated the temple? And then the second question is, Jesus replaces the temple and all the needs that the temple fulfills. We were previously taught that the temple was the place where we meet God. But we understand now that the sacrificial system is a human construct that helps us to discharge our violence, which we then experience as the divine. Jesus is asking us to surrender this human dependence on the temple and on sacrifice and scapegoating. How does that make you feel? Do you feel liberated or do you feel unsettled? So start with those two questions. First of all, how in your Christian life have you experienced Eucharist and other sort of temple holiness associated with the Eucharist or not? Or have you experienced temple holiness in your Christian life in any place or time? And then secondly, how do you feel about Jesus asking us to let go or surrender the temple and temple holiness and all that goes along with it? Do you think it is enough? I mean, if it's something that's so deeply ingrained in the human psyche, this need to scapegoat and sacrifice, do you think forgiveness and mercy is enough to replace it? That's another way of asking it. Anyone can say anything. It doesn't have to be related to those questions.
I think it's kind of deep, and like I'm thinking I need the week to think about that to go back because
Yeah.
like right away I feel like I've experienced that, but to come up with a story of it,
Yeah.
I'd have to
Well,
think about
I mean, I can tell you from our experience as a community here that it took a long time for us to fully reimagine the Eucharist because it has so much baggage associated with it that over the last 2 millennia that has built up. Especially because our background is a Catholic background, so there's a lot loaded on the Mass in the Catholic tradition. A lot of beautiful stuff, but also a lot of the language. We were trying to say, well, how can you celebrate the Mass or celebrate Eucharist without using sacrificial language? And and a lot of the songs that are sung, the hymns that are sung in churches, use a lot of sacrificial language as well. It's interesting if you pick up a hymnal and to go through it with the eyes of René Girard, sort of, and looking into how much the language is sacrificial often, and to try to get away from that and with that and look instead with the eyes of mercy and forgiveness was a challenge actually to us, and we gradually created I think a different kind of language, but anyway, it's just interesting to look at your tradition and your own particular Christian or faith communities practices and with that eye, that single eye, and see what you see. Maggie, you got your hand up?
Yeah, even though I've been in bed, I've been listening. And this segment story, what it's taught me is that it was so freeing what Jesus did, because really the temple is all of nature. Every single person we meet is like meeting another potential temple because we love people. And it was freeing because I don't have to be in a church pew and have such a formal communion to feel that I'm in touch with God. I feel like Jesus doing this gives us the freedom to be more personally enriched by Jesus, so that every time we have a meal, we are being fed by Jesus. Every time we have a drink of water, we are being fed. So in reality, for me, it's like all the food or dinner times, uh, we're being blessed.
Mm.
I think that's what I've learned from this wonderful teaching. So thank you.
That's right. I mean, uh, the we can talk about the temple then becomes the temple of our hearts. I actually, I embrace it, what you're saying there, that every place becomes a place where you can meet God, every person, every relationship. I kind of I've moved away from even using that, the temple of my heart. I just don't, for me, the word temple now is kind of, I just want to get not associate it in any way at all with God or prayer or spirituality, because it's become so loaded for me with violence. So now I tend to not use that word temple, although I know a lot of people in a lot of faith traditions still have temple, and it means different things to different people. But the sense of what you're saying, Maggie, is absolutely correct. I mean, what a thing that Jesus did was that to to say that you don't need to have that. You can just throw that into the sea of chaos, just get rid of it and be completely free, like you're saying. You can find God in all spaces and all places. And
Right.
there's no violence in God. So God does not become, there's no distance, therefore. You can just be fully yourself, warts and all. You can be Jesus on the cross and Golgotha was closer to God at that moment than anyone.
And there's no
So,
clear walls anymore.
right,
The world is a sacred place.
right. Yes. I mean, I think the thing that Jesus did to bring God into all the unclean spaces of human life, God can transform anyone. I think of those people who feel like they're irredeemable, people who feel like they've done something that can never be forgiven, or that live in those dark places. There's no place. Jesus shows us in this lesson that there's no place that the light of God's love cannot um, transform, and change. And all you need is to believe. He says, have faith, and you can throw that. There's that temple holiness that drags us all down, basically. That Deuteronomic worldview that drags us all down. That life of living under the accuser. Satan is called the accuser, right? Um, so all those, anyone who's felt accused or judged, there's that's not God. That's the accuser. That's a different voice. So just enter into that relationship with this God of love, totally non-violent, the God who created you beautiful, all that stuff, and who only wants to love you. That's all part of this, getting rid of that sacrificial feeling that you're not good enough. I think that sacrificial holiness stuff is the barrier that prevents people from praying. Like you're not good enough, or I'll wait until I'm a better person, and then I'll start praying. All that stuff. It's all to do with this temple holiness, this sense of clean and unclean. Mm. I have a couple more questions to finish up with. How much of our culture or the world around us do you think is still caught up in the sacrificial system of, scapegoating and sacrificial system, especially that holiness that's loaded on it? And how does Jesus teach us to deal with our violence? And what has been our experience of the Eucharist in this context of Jesus' teaching about nonviolence? Some questions to think about this week.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll finish up the cycle with those questions. I wanted to let you know that we're going to be taking a 2-week break, just because of other stuff that's coming on, basically on my side. But we'll pick up again. I can't remember the exact date, but Maggie sent it in the email with the final 3 lessons. The final 3 lessons are from history to its end. And those 3 lessons, we're going to talk about wisdom, the first lesson, then Daniel and the Son of Man, the second lesson, and apocalyptic. And then the third lesson is basically we're talking about resurrection and the new creation, all that good stuff. So that's how we're going to close out the course with the final cycle.
April 9th.
Sorry?
April 9th.